listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello, and welcome to this July 2nd edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. John Williams will tell us more about today's guest, Lori Adams Brown.
Today on Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Lori Adams Brown is an international speaker, business executive, and podcast host. She has lived all over the world and has a unique perspective when dealing with people from varying cultures and nationalities. It also helps that she speaks 6 languages. Lori is a connector who puts people first and values the lasting partnerships she builds. She is an active listener who cares about the stories people share and is energized by communication and teamwork. She is also a lifelong learner and known for bringing innovative perspectives and questions to the decision-making table. Join today's conversation with impressive leader Lori Adams Brown and learn how becoming a better listener can improve your family and your work culture.
Thank you, John. Lori Adams Brown, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Looking forward to talking to you today. So let's talk about your podcast first. Your podcast is called A World of Difference. How can regular people make a world of difference in their own neighborhoods or their communities?
Well, I would say it starts with listening, and that's why I started the podcast. There's just a lot of voices out there that have taught me so much throughout my life, growing up in international schools where my friends were from all over the world. My teachers were from all over the world, and it just developed in me a curiosity for all the different ways to live this human life. And, some of it is just really different from how each of us grew up. And so I grew up with this language around it's not wrong, it's just different. Are there things that are wrong out there? Yes. And that's where we want to come together with our differences around the table to listen, to understand one another and our perspectives. And when we do bring those differences around the table and listen well for the facts and the feelings and the values that people are trying to communicate, while suspending judgment, which is really hard to do for me and a lot of us, then those differences that we bring around the table really do make a difference in the world. And I just see that in the world today, I started to notice how increasingly polarized not only the US is, which is the country where I have been a citizen my whole life, even though I grew up abroad and lived abroad in my career for 20 years in Southeast Asia. I noticed that even in other countries around the world, we were starting to see this polarization. Some of it attributable to things like the tech industry here in Silicon Valley, which has contributed to social media. And, social media is great. I've met a lot of people like you through X, and met them in real life or been on podcasts with each other. So there's so much good there. We can listen to one another, but so much of those algorithms really promote this angry posture where we don't listen and we get really limbic with each other, and people say things online that they wouldn't say in real life. So I just realized, I want to do my part. I want to create a table and I want to welcome people to my table. And as they come, I want to listen and learn. And it's been the greatest journey for me just to learn from each of my guests. Every time I learn so much. And so, I just encourage people to come along with me and listen. From there, we have our calls to action that are naturally emerge when we hear other people talk about the difference they're making.
My podcast is a lot of the same type of format where I just ask a few questions and then I just listen. I don't talk over the people. I just want to hear what they've got to say. That's how we learn from each other. So let's focus on listening a little bit more. How important of a life or work skill is listening?
Well, apparently it's pretty important as a work skill because I work in Silicon Valley, and in my role with a tech company here, I'm over all of our global leadership and development, our talent development, and then our, the training. And so early on in my time with this particular company, I helped us sign a contract with the Center for Creative Leadership. If you're not familiar with them, they've been around for a while and they have research-based curriculum. And they, a lot of the fundamentals of these skills that I'm going around teaching, and I've hired a global team to train and teach on, is the basic module of it is module called Listen to Understand. And I take, everybody from individual contributors to managers and executives in our company globally, whether it's Taiwan or the UK or here all over the US. And I, teach them along with my team skills on how to listen. And we really just practice some of these basic skills in 60-second partner, breakouts or groups of 4. And it's hard work. People call this soft skills, and I disagree with that term because it implies somehow that it's easy. I don't think it's easy. I think listening to understand has always been hard. And I think in the way our world is so polarized today, like I mentioned, with some of the algorithms that favor anger and interrupting and really rude behavior that we see, not only in some of the most powerful politicians in our generation and the way they talk and interrupt people and evoke anger, but also in how some of the younger generation has had this modeled for them, both in social media and from some of our leaders. And so I think that in a workplace, we're seeing the effects of some of that. There's people that will talk about a toxic boss or psychological abuse in the workplace. That's something I myself am a survivor of. And a couple workplaces ago, not where I'm at now, certainly it's a great work environment. I'm really privileged and flourishing where I'm at and helping others to flourish too. But I think that learning to listen, understand is a skill, whether you're an engineer in the tech industry or whether you're a therapist and that's what you do for your full-time job is listen. This is hard work. As a parent of teenagers, this is hard work. And I think that all of our relationships benefit in work and outside of work when we truly learn and do the hard work of listening to understand.
So how do you improve as a listener if that doesn't come naturally to you?
Yeah, I would encourage people to take 60 seconds with someone else. Maybe it's a loved one or a friend or a colleague at work, and choose to listen to them tell a story, maybe about their favorite vacation they ever went on. Just ask them some question, that they can give you an answer about a story that shows that they want to talk about. So favorite holiday, favorite vacation is a pretty standard one that helps people talk. And then just sit there and listen and make note of what you hear for yourself. Maybe even write that down after you've listened to them. And then there's these 3 categories of listening to understand, and there are facts, feelings, and values. And typically we all have a comfort zone. So that's really normal to have one of those that you primarily listen for. I certainly do. And what you realize is if you're only listening for one of those, you're missing 2/3 of what people are trying to tell you, which is kind of mind blowing, which is why I'm telling you it's hard work. And so I think that just starting there is a really good exercise. Once you can kind of nail down what your comfort zone is, then you can move on into how to add on the other 2. And one of the tricks and tips I give when I train is once you try to add on that. So for example, I'm a facts listener. And so when I have to add on feelings or values, I have to be very intentional about listening for those things. And so one of the things I ask people to do when I train globally on this is to imagine yourself at a beach. I live near Santa Cruz. I'm a huge beach person. Beach is my happy place. It's a place I go to even in my therapy. I've done some EMDR therapy for like I said, I worked in a hostile work environment and experienced workplace abuse. And so as I've worked through that in this therapy called EMDR, which kind of helps the brain cross the bilateral sections of the brain and help you process what in trauma is more of a scattered memory as opposed to how memories normally get coded in your brain. But if you see a car accident and you see a shattered glass on the road, that's kind of how trauma embeds in the brain. So some of the therapy like EMDR helps you process that and kind of re-put it into a place where it's less physically and neurologically, triggering and that kind of thing. So very good therapy. But as I've worked through some of that, you always have to have sort of a happy place that you can go to. And so my happy place is a beach that I used to go to growing up in Venezuela in the Caribbean. It's a beautiful place called Playuelita. And it's a wonderful place. So when I go there in my mind, I can really find a place that relaxes me and helps me kind of work through things. But yeah, I encourage people to imagine themselves on a beach, even if that's not your happy place, because most people, our neurological systems feel good there. And so as you're adding on something else, which is hard work, for me, I have facts in front of me, and that's like what I say, imagine that like a beach ball that you're holding while you're out in the ocean. And so for me, it's like pushing facts down the shore a little bit And when I listen to this person, I'm going to have two options of a beach ball to center in front of me. So I'll have feelings or I'll have values, and I choose one of those and I focus on that in a conversation with someone, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. It doesn't take long. And the trick about that is you really aren't pushing the facts beach ball away because it's your comfort zone and it's always going to be there. But by adding on another one, your brain and your mind open up to what you're hearing a little bit more. And then eventually you're starting to try to listen to all three. It's hard. It's really hard work to do that. And I don't think most of our brains can do it for long periods of time, especially when we're starting out. But that's kind of an exercise I walk people through to kind of visualize it. And we're seeing great success of people in our company and great ROI from it. It's people are putting it into practice and starting to interrupt less, trying to suspend judgment, asking clarifying questions, and really starting to listen for things they've missed for years, me included. I'm still working on it too.
Okay. I don't want to dwell on this question too much, but this is really fascinating to me. I do want to like cut it down a little bit more. You talked a lot about the facts part, and how do you distinguish or how do you define the feelings and the values in this three-part equation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think most people understand when we say facts, and typically they understand feelings a little more, but values can be really hard to understand. The values are typically those concepts that guide our lives. So people, if you don't really know what your values are, there's some great value exercises out there. And, when I went through years ago is where you have a bunch of cards with all these typical values on there, and you just go through a process of elimination till you come out with like 5. I keep a little stack of 5 on my desk. So I remind myself what my values are so I can live by them and work by them, especially in the work I do in global talent development, but just for me as a person in my community and my relationships outside of work. But I would say values are hard sometimes because they're not typically stated. We won't usually be in a conversation and be telling someone, my values are, I enjoy adventure and I'm going to prioritize that when I go on a vacation or when I seek a job, or, some people really value family. And so for them, it's going to be family first in all their decisions, whether it's work or life or anything else. Others value significance. They want to be significant in the role that they have. There's so many different values. And when you listen, for example, if somebody tells you about their favorite vacation or their favorite holiday, and you're listening for values intentionally, you'll start to realize they're not saying them in the story, but you're picking up on the reason they made that choice of that vacation, who they brought with them, how much money they spent or didn't spend. They're going to say things that tell you who they are and what their values are, but those can be one of the harder ones to listen for and to notice. It's like a really deeper level. I describe that one for myself, at least, as, I grew up snorkeling in the Caribbean in Venezuela. And then my dad is a scuba diver. We saw really different things because of that. I was seeing surface level and lots of fish and fun, marine life, but going down, like he's getting toward the edge of like the phosphorescence, like there's stuff down there that's like, wow, we don't even really know what it is yet. And so deep. And so I think values, when I listen, are kind of that way down deep in the ocean that I have to dig for and really work for and get there in a harder aspect of how do I work for that and go down deeper. So does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I love that story. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to another part of your job. What does an inclusivity specialist do? And then as a secondary question, is that work made more challenging by some of the combating forces to diversity, equity, and inclusion that are out there on either side of the spectrum?
I think that when you do the work of trying to be inclusive, there are going to be forces that oppose that in our culture and our society. Going against the status quo means there are reasons why certain people have been excluded over time in every society and in the subcultures of that society or in a culture of a workplace. So, for example, when I think about being a woman in podcasting, I started out, we just didn't really know what the stats were, but I think it was my first podcast conference I spoke at in LA. And they were telling the statistics in the US, at least, of how many women are podcasting and how many men. And it's only at that time, I think the stats, I don't know if they've changed recently, but at that time, which was just a couple of years ago, only 15% of podcasters in the US are women. which really surprised me because one thing that people say about women is that we talk, which if you also look at which if you look at the statistics, even on that and research that's been done in the workplace is they've done great research, very insightful research on workplaces, and they'll interview and research men and their perspective of a particular meeting. And they'll, also monitor how much time women speak in the meeting, how much time men speak in the meeting, which is very quantifiable. They can measure the amount of minutes, the amount of words, all of it. And I can't remember the exact statistics, but it's surprising how often men, because of the way our society has trained us, men and women, will think that women spoke in the meeting way more than they actually did. Like a huge difference in how much they spoke and how much they thought they spoke. And then how much men spoke versus what was reality. Men often don't realize how much more they're speaking than they are in meetings like that. So in the world of women at work, and I remember somebody who worked in the Obama administration talking about how even in DC politics, this was something that women would do for each other, which is when a woman would raise an innovative idea in a meeting, other women around her would reiterate that for her, because generally speaking, often in our society here in the US at least, and other places I've lived, I think this is likely true. When a woman speaks in a meeting, especially when there's more men in there than women, which is often the case in many industries, the woman's idea won't be heard or taken seriously when it's first mentioned. And so the value of another woman saying, oh, just like Lori said, we should do XYZ, because often, and I've had this personal experience, not in my current workplace, but in previous ones, where I will raise an idea in a meeting and it won't get heard. And another man will raise the same idea and everyone will assume it was his idea and they'll go with it. So whether it's a woman or a person of color or any person who might not be as represented in the workplace, or who in our societies around the world aren't the majority, like in Singapore, the majority would be Chinese Singaporeans. Then you have Indian Singaporeans, and then Malay Singaporeans, who are the indigenous, who are less in the population and less represented often in positions of power politically and that kind of thing. And so whatever the demographics are in whatever society you're living in, it's important to note that the voices that are going to be heard are going to be whoever is at the top of that social hierarchy, right? So in the US, we would think white men at the top, right? And so it's not that we're saying that to make anyone feel guilty or it's anyone's fault. It is, right? It's what it is. And so the more we can be honest about recognizing that, inclusivity means you have to go and make the extra effort to listen to the voices that are naturally not going to be heard, and put in practice some things in your workplace, in meetings, in your hiring, in your recruiting, in the way you write job descriptions, all of that, to keep that in mind and to bring in voices that could help you understand, how does this job description read for you as a woman? Is there too much masculine language for this job for an engineer in our workplace? Things we wouldn't even think about, but getting that different perspective, it really matters. There's many ways we can do that, but also part of your question had to do with the DEI and some of the pushback we're seeing against that and the culture. And even though I haven't lived in the US for most of my life, I moved here just before COVID from Singapore. And I did my studies here. So after I graduated from international school in Venezuela, I moved to the States to do my undergraduate education as well as my master's, and then moved to Southeast Asia straight after that, where I got my first job out of grad school in Indonesia. But I would say that, in all of those situations, we have different language and learning. I learned to speak 6 languages. I'm fluent in 4, and I studied 2 others as well. And language is constantly changing. English is one of those languages that we've known for years as one of those languages that changes very rapidly. And it's because it's so widely spoken around the world. I think is one of the reasons, but also because the US has had a lot of innovation and, things are just sort of constantly changing. And I think in this generation in particular, I hear my Gen Z teenagers say words that they have to translate for me. Like, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? It sounds bad. No, it's not bad, Mom. And so, yeah, language is just that way. It has nuance. And so, there's buzzwords that are like, in the past someone might say, and then they suddenly become something you should never, ever say. And having lived overseas where English was spoken in Singapore, for example, they call it Singlish. It was a British colony, but the way English is spoken there is what we call Singlish. And some of the words we use there wouldn't be used here. They might be really offensive, and vice versa. I have friends from New Zealand or the UK and Australia, and sometimes they'll say things or I'll say things and your eyebrows raise. It's like, that clearly does not mean what it means to you. So I think DEI is one of those things. It used to be something that was positive here in Silicon Valley. We had a lot of people being hired for DEI positions. Some people call it DEIB, adding belonging, which I really like, or J for justice. But it has recently become this sort of tricky thing to talk about because it's now seen as very, opposite of what the intention was somehow divisive. And so, I think that some of it's not bad. We want to find words that communicate and are inclusive to everybody. But I do think it is strange that words like inclusion and equity can't be seen as for everyone. But if it is a word that's not being helpful, I understand the reason for shifting it. It does make things complicated when you've got branding in a company or somebody's job title and you've been using this for a while. But ultimately, we do want to, at least I want to, and I'm training leaders in our company globally and through my podcast, which is my own, side work, not related to my company at all, to help us use language that communicates that everybody should feel safe at work. Everybody belongs. Everybody should be able to question, and creating that psychological safety is really important.
Okay. So what did you learn living in Central to South America or Asia that you don't think you would have ever learned if you had lived in the United States your whole life?
There's so many things. I wouldn't even know where to begin. But I think if I could choose one that encompasses all of those, it was you really to understand what you need to move forward in life as a healthy, flourishing individual. You don't have all the knowledge. There's so many other perspectives you need to live a life that you want and to create a family that you want and to be a kind of person that makes a difference in the world in any way. You need other people. And in the US, by and large, it's known as a culture that's very individualistic, and that is to our detriment. And so I think being raised in a collectivist society in Venezuela, where you didn't just make decisions based on your own best interests, that's not valued at all. And in Asia, in Indonesia, and Singapore, neither one of those countries would have valued that at all. And so I learned the beauty of making decisions to help people in a collective move forward and not just for myself. And I don't think I would have learned that in the same way growing up here in the US.
Okay. So you posted something recently on X about women in STEM fields, and that's what interested me in having you on the podcast today. And just for my audience, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. And those fields are still heavily dominated by males, especially white males, as you just recently mentioned. How do you attract more women and minorities to those fields?
Yeah, I think that it starts so much earlier than when they're applying for a role in a company like where I work. And we do have some great women in STEM that work in the company where I'm at, and they're just amazing and inspiring. And just, they've had to work really twice as hard as most men. And I think women in most fields are experiencing that unless they're in a very female dominated field. But I think it starts so much earlier than before they even come to apply to our company. And this is something that, as a lot of people in different nonprofits or in educational spaces are certainly working on and know way more about than I do. But I think about somebody that I have mentored in the past, and she is here in the Bay Area. She works at NASA Ames Research Center, and she's the highest woman in her field as an aerospace engineer, worked on the Mars helicopter. And, she grew up in a rural part of the US, and, certainly what wasn't in any kind of school system that would have favored women in this field. And she has some unusual parts of her story as to how she got where she is, which is kind of how it has to be, because the system does not encourage that. I mean, what we largely see is that there is an age, in general, when girls are in school, they kind of start realizing maybe I shouldn't raise my hand because I'm not going to get called on in class. So there's things like that happen. And this is even with female elementary school teachers, because all the reasons I mentioned, female podcasters are less, our voices are listened to less in writing books and, writing scripts for movies and being lead actors in a movie and, being music people listen to. So our, women's voices in general are not primarily listened to. And we're trying to increase that, and it is increasing, but it's a very uphill battle that gets exhausting. And so from little girls learning to not raise their hand, there is something about the STEM field especially that requires a curiosity and a pushing the boundaries. And because it is such a male-dominated field, but also because the nature of STEM is that the scientific method requires you to be a questioner and to seek information with trial and error. And some of the ways we raise girls in the US is to, if you look at some of the research on boys and girls in elementary school and how they're even interacted with on the playground and their families. And once again, this is no one's fault. It's just, this is what we do. This is how it's been. And so going against it is really hard. But you'll often hear just little conversations throughout a little boy's life where people invite him to dream big dreams. And that lends toward fields like STEM, because going to Mars is a huge dream, right? I actually am raising a son who's studying aerospace engineering. So I've seen that product in him. Yeah, he does want to go to Mars and build a rocket. But I mean, the world encouraged him in that direction too, And so when you think about little girls, they're not, if they do dream big dreams, they often get squashed early on, or people give a certain look that's like, oh, honey. And, maybe you should marry an aerospace engineer. Yeah, exactly. And it's because in the movies, the men were in the rockets, and, even women, we have, is it Sally Ride that was the first female astronaut? Like it's a rare thing that we celebrate even now. It's not as common. And so it starts way earlier than the recruitment process, but certainly we would want our job descriptions to not be full of masculine language when we write them for these positions. We know there's great programs out there for like Girls Who Code is something that was started years ago. There are programs out there for women in STEM. I was a Girl Scout leader many years ago for my daughter's troop, and they had a STEM focus they were rolling out. So I took the little Girl Scout troop to a tech company for a visit, and they got to meet women. But it's because it's rare, and you're having to be intentional, because the ocean we swim in is not going to encourage little girls to go into this field. And in the process of them studying in academia, it's going to be a lot of male students, and it's going to be an uphill battle for them all along. So we do what we can on our side to make it a friendly and open and inclusive place. But there are so many other forces at large before they even get to us that I think are really important.
I agree. My son is a mechanical engineer, and his school intentionally recruited women. They had specific scholarships for women, which is positive. That's a great thing. Yeah. But there weren't a lot of minority, male or women, at the school. And I think he was probably the only minority student among his engineering cohort. That doesn't mean that I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say here, except it wasn't easy if he was looking for collaboration or somebody who could identify with him. But he's successful, and he did a good job of going through the program, and he's doing very well at his job.
Good for him. I'm sure he's had to work twice as hard. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd like to see more women and more minorities in STEM fields.
Me too. Yeah. Because I mean, they're creating things. Yeah. I was just going to say they're creating things that we all use. When my son was, clearly his whole life, he's kind of been going toward this. I mean, he was little, he shot rockets in the park in Singapore. Like, he's just always been this guy. And so it's not a real shock that he ended up going this route. But, when I think about that, I think about how some people would say, well, to make a difference in the world, to do good in the world, you should be somebody that goes into nonprofit or, helps people in Africa get water. And of course we need those. And it was such a part of that world for so long. I did tsunami relief in Indonesia. I was a liaison with the UN, worked with nonprofits, most of my life until I switched more into business. But I remember growing up in my international school, and that's why I ended up majoring in sociology, actually, was because I did Model UN. A lot of, what I learned there was the nonprofits and the good work being done. And a lot of the multinational companies were like, we're looking at them and it's like, they're polluting the world. They're destroying the rainforest over in Brazil next door to us here. And so some of that just had a real bad taste in my mouth of how corporations and, people, even things like wanting to go to outer space, but not preserving this planet. Why would we focus on so much, energy and effort toward that? But the more I sort of started to see the world through my son's eyes and what he was doing, typically people might say, well, he's just not going to go into a field where he's going to contribute to society at all. But no, anybody who goes into something that builds an engineer that designs a bridge that helps people go across it, they're caring for our world. They're making a difference. People who help us understand how to build the technology to build a rocket to get to Mars, we're going to learn a lot about ourselves, even in going there. Right. And so, at some point in my life, I really understood that in a different way. And so good for your son that he's stuck with it and going through that. I know it's not easy to be the one or of only few in a room that look like you. And that's a really hard space to be in academia when you're trying to just study in a very difficult field. To have that extra layer is really hard. So good for him that he's been able to be successful. He seems like he's a hard worker.
He definitely is. I'm very proud of him. He just got married last month. So I had a chance to do my father, the groom speech. So I got a chance to tell him all that stuff. And I cried like a baby, even though I didn't think I would. just very, so very proud of him. Mm. All right. So your bio says that you led large-scale global efforts to make sustainable social impact, or what you're talking about with nonprofits. Yeah. So what does that mean, the sustainable social impact?
So I think that, when I went out of grad school into Indonesia, there's always choices you make and jobs that you're kind of going for in the field that I was in at the time. And you can go more like large scale nonprofit, and I kind of went sort of something medium range at that time. But then I also got involved with like more grassroots Indonesian based nonprofit. And that helped me really see, and also being trained in community development in the Philippines by Filipinos and learning so much there. About local herbs and how they used medicine. And it was, living in Asia, there was always this mixture between Western medicine and Asian medicine. In Singapore, they would call it, TCM, Chinese medicine, whatever. But learning from locals about how they wanted to see change, and then implementing community development by gathering a group of, in some cases, like in Indonesia, the entire village together, and there's a village leader and there's a system in the society. I worked in Aceh province where the tsunami happened 19 years ago. And there is something in the Acehnese culture called like a musyawara. And that's where they get the village together and there's like a village leader, but they make a joint decision. So they get to share their perspectives. And so in community development, by working with that local Indonesian based grassroots nonprofit, it helped to see that this is not just change we're bringing in as these white saviors and giving it to them and expecting them to keep it going, that actually listening to what they want, and me being fluent in the language, but also relying on Indonesians who aren't just fluent in the language, but it's their mother tongue that I'm working with, and letting them help me see some of the cultural nuances that, even though I lived there 10 years, I could still sometimes miss because I wasn't born and raised there. And really just listening to understand and learning. And then when they come up with, this is what we need, and going with that and supporting them with some of the resources from the outside that could help them, such as micro business loans, which we did with women. And it's very widely known around the world, and community development has been known for years based on the research that when we give micro business loans to women, mothers in particular, who happen to be the ones that receive it usually, the money goes toward not just them, but toward the kids, the family. But unfortunately, and there's a lot of reasons for this, when you only give to men, it doesn't end up always affecting the whole family or even the village. It doesn't go like it should. And so we had 100% payback with our micro business loans with women, and it was really good to see. And then we did do some with men. We had some brick factories that was very small scale. So when we say brick factory, it's not like, what I mean is there's like a water buffalo, right? This is that level. And it churns the mud because they train it to do that. And then they get the bricks and they have a kiln, and it's very small scale. But when the tsunami came in, a lot of houses were destroyed, obviously. And so in order to rebuild houses, well, you needed bricks. And so we had to start with bricks. And then when we get to they didn't have the money to start their whole brick factory over again. So doing the micro business loans with that community was really successful. And then it's the system itself, we embedded some education within it. So what are your needs? What will help you? And so I worked more on the side of the medical director. So I brought in volunteers who were medical doctors or nurses. We set up some makeshift pharmacies to deal early on with some of the, first phase disaster relief type of things, which are wounds, very, very difficult ones. There was a woman who had multiple splinters in her eye, and it was day 100. So they have a 100th day in the culture of mourning the ones who've passed. And she had multiple children, a large family of many children that she had lost, and her extended family were all gone in a village that was largely wiped out. She was one of the few survivors that survived that wasn't on a boat fishing when it happened. So a lot of the men came back and their families were all gone, And,
Wow.
but she was one of the ones who survived that village miraculously, but she'd lost everything. She was a busy mom one day with all these kids to feed and, take care of. And then the next day it was all gone. And so she was not only traumatized in her body and almost catatonic from just the trauma of everything she had endured. And it was certainly the body that kept the score. But I think what was fascinating and scary was that when we took her to one of our US doctors who was there, he looked in her eye and saw multiple splinters that had been in her eye. And it was day 100. And she didn't even mention that pain. And I think that it's because the pain of losing her human loved ones that she cared for. I think she had like a brother maybe left that came with her. And the emotional pain far superseded the physical pain. And we were able to help her and get those splinters out. But the only word I heard her say the entire time was when we got her and into the car, and we were very gentle with her. And she just said this one Indonesian word, which is takut, and it means afraid. But there was nothing in her body that showed fear. So it was just like really listening to understand that one word she said is, wow, this woman is terrified and experiencing obviously PTSD. And I don't know what noise, was it the door shutting? Because a lot of noises can be triggering. We see that in, people who came back from Vietnam. And that's when we started to really understand a lot about PTSD was the Vietnam vets, right? That any kind of PTSD, whether it's from a tsunami, an earthquake, or any event, often a loud noise, if it was included in the event, can trigger the body's neurological system to react. So we saw for a really long time, even a couple of years later after the tsunami, loud noises would make everybody just jump in a different way than they had before. But she didn't physically respond, only her words. And so I think that, I learned a lot during that time is that some of the grand scale things that came in, of course, Catholic Relief Services, the UN, all these big NGOs that were there did great work, but they were sort of in for a while and then gone. The work I was very privileged to be involved in was a long-term work, and it preceded the tsunami time during the Civil War. So I was there 5 years prior, and it was there I was able to stay 5 years after. So to see more of a long-term impact, and then the Indonesians that are still there, they're doing great work, are incredible and inspiring, and really there for the long haul to see that community continue to work toward flourishing, which they absolutely deserve. Not just because they've been through a civil war and earthquake and tsunami, but because everybody deserves to flourish wherever they are.
Okay. So you've done a lot of different types of things in your career. What types of jobs or projects have been the most fulfilling for you personally?
Really, the tsunami was a special time. It was the hardest thing I've ever endured, I would say, just in terms of listening to the amount of trauma people went through. My best friend at the time, my best Chinese friend, lost her baby. And that was really hard to walk through that with her. And I learned a lot about trauma and how it impacts children and adults differently, I ended up translating for a world-renowned trauma therapist who worked the Columbine shooting in Denver. He was on, like, if a child witnessed a murder in Denver, they would call him in to help that child. He ended up moving to work in Russia with the school where the Chechnyan rebels had gone in and shot up a school, and was working there when the tsunami hit. And then we brought him in and I translated for him. And so learned a ton about how children process trauma and ways to help them through it. And then also just became trauma informed myself, which is something I really use in my company where I work now, because the reality is we don't have to be in an earthquake or a tsunami to experience traumatic things in our lives. And being the kind of leader who listens and helps people work through things, I would say is something that's a skill that's kind of followed me and been really important to implement. So one of the things I talk about on stages at conferences and in leadership summits is the really crucial part of psychological safety as a leader in a workplace, whether you're a middle manager, executive, or an individual contributor. We can all contribute to psychological safety. And Google did this project several years ago called Project Aristotle, which is a lot of people are familiar with, but they studied what is the key to successful teams. And they realized that psychological safety was the key. And so creating that really requires open communication to encourage transparency on your team. It requires active listening, like we've already talked about, inclusivity and respect. You want to encourage diverse voices. You want to be respectful in how you interact. You want to be a supportive leader, and you want to model that behavior. So not just say, hey, as a leader, tell me how I come across to you. How do you experience me? But being psychologically safe for the answer, even when you don't want to hear it, that somebody won't be retaliated against. They won't get fired. They won't get demoted. They won't be shunned or disinvited to meetings because they say, you're hard to be around, right? So modeling that behavior, empowerment, providing employees the autonomy to make decisions and ownership of their work. And then, creating these constructive feedback loops where you have regular feedback, where it's both formal and informal, and you really have positive reinforcement for people to say what they need to say. And then it really requires building trust. Trust isn't automatically given. And in most cases should not be. It should be built. And I use this illustration with my kids because my kids, especially my aerospace engineer, when he was younger, loved Legos. And then I had twins after that. And his younger brother is the biggest Lego guy. So we just use a Lego illustration in our family that we've always kind of used. But trust is built one Lego at a time. Eventually you have a tower and it can get knocked down and then you have to rebuild it. But I even use that at work. So you have a lot of engineers, so people get it. And even the adult engineers love their Legos. But trust is built one Lego at a time. And it requires showing up in small moments and being there for people and being a safe person yourself.
All right. Has raising 3 teenagers is that your superpower?
I wish it were.
Being able to survive that.
I know. We recently saw, if nobody has seen it yet, we saw Inside Out 2, which is based on teenagers. And it's here based in the Bay Area as well, which is kind of fun for us. People clapped in the theater when we saw it the other day. I think people know people in the credits or whatever. We have Pixar around here. But yeah, it's not easy to raise teenagers in any generation. I think that one of the things I took out of the Inside Out movie is that there is something that shifts biologically in a teenager as they get to that phase of life where for a period of time, their emotions get way more intense. It scares them. It scares the parents sometimes, but it's normal. It's normal development. So the way they portray it in the movie is, if you remember the first film, there's this board where the different emotions like joy and, they're all pushing the buttons. But then once puberty hits this Riley, they touch the button. It's like, whoa, what just happened? It's like, I barely touched it. Right. So it normalized the experience that parents of teenagers and teenagers themselves have where the emotions get strong. You don't want to be too concerned about it, except that if it lasts a really long time. But the nature of teenagehood, I guess, is that they're going to have strong emotions, but they don't necessarily last. And so being a supportive parent, I wish I had some superpowers in this way. I don't. I'm just like every other parent of teenagers, trying my best to be supportive of them and listen to understand them without judgment, which is really hard because they say some wild things.
Well, I have twin stepsons who are 16 years old.
Ours are
So
16.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm there. I've raised 4 kids. I was a single dad for a long time
Oh,
and raised
wow.
4 kids. My youngest turned 25 yesterday,
Oh,
and then got remarried to a woman who had young boys. And I thought, okay, here we go again.
it's a
And the
ride.
experience is very different. Well, I wasn't scared because I thought, okay, I've been through this before. How different can it be? Well, it's very different.
It is. It is. It's crazy.
But I'm hanging in there. I'm hanging
Yeah.
in there so far, and so are they. So we're all coexisting at this point. Nobody's had to call the police or do anything.
That's something. That's something.
That's an accomplishment.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So for final wrap up here, are there any final words of wisdom that you'd like to give out to my audience?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I'm getting asked to talk about quite a bit recently, and I've been writing about and podcasting about, is workplace abuse. And I'm seeing an increasing amount of people, trying to find resources about if they are working with a toxic boss or if they're not feeling psychologically safe at work. And I guess there's a big difference between not feeling psychologically or feeling psychologically safe and being psychologically abused. And that's kind of a spectrum within there. But having experienced and being a survivor of psychological abuse in a workplace and an advocate in that space now, I'm a researcher. I just by like hobby, like I love it, not just because I have a master's degree and know how to do research, but because I just do. I just like reading books and learning what's out there and learning new stuff. And there's some great research out there and books that have helped me understand some things. But I'm currently also just writing about ways I walk through both the psychological abuse in a workplace that involve multiple things being done to sort of silence and belittle and intimidate and use coercive control in one-on-one meetings. And there was one meeting where I was mobbed and retaliated against in the form of being terminated and given an NDA tied to severance. All of these things aren't legal anymore, but I, at the time, was working in a nonprofit, a religious-based nonprofit. So there's some religious liberties that get loopholes around this. But in a workplace where I see psychological safety working well, and I've had most of my workplaces have been places like that, and also seeing the absence of it, I'm in this place where I am writing and speaking about what I wish I would have known. What are some red flags, how to notice them? What are different types of abuse that someone might experience? Like, what is gaslighting? How do you whistleblow in an environment like that? Because I've had that experience about how to do that and what to expect, how to build a village around you of support when you're walking through that, because that's important. What kind of therapists or coaches you need to bring into your village to help you walk through that well. These are all things I learned and sort of writing and speaking about what I wish I would have known that would have helped me along the way. And so, yeah, if anybody is in that position, really, I would encourage you to subscribe to my Substack newsletter or to my podcast where I talk about these things. And if you're somebody who is looking for somebody to speak about this at your conference, I do that on occasion when I can fit it into my schedule as well. So yeah, really wanting to help people in our workplaces flourish with the keys and the tools, and for leaders to know how to be the kind of leader that's a psychologically safe person, because teams thrive under that and we have better employee engagement. It really impacts the ROI in very significant ways. And our organizations, we can see the bottom line increase because our teams are successful when we create psychological safety. So something that I am very passionate about because of my own lived experience, but also I really want people to feel safe in their workplace and for organizations to grow. And they just happen to all happen at the same time when we do that. So.
All right, that sounds great. And I will include a link to your website in the show notes, the show description when it comes out in early July. So my guest this week has been international speaker, business executive, and podcast host, Lori Adams Brown. Lori, thanks for being here and sharing the stories. I've enjoyed having you here today.
Thanks, Melvin. It's been an honor to get to know you, and thanks for having me on.
Well, come back anytime. You're welcome anytime you want to come back on and follow up on any of these topics or any other topics that you're passionate about.
Thanks, Melvin.
So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.